Hello, I'm Anthony and this is my art. For this video I'm going to talk you through the process of painting this still life of these oranges right here. I've never actually painted a still life before, so this was a bit of an experiment for me and I got to learn a lot from it. So I'm going to talk you through exactly how I painted it from start to finish. So let's go. Yeah, so this is the photo I chose. It was quite a juicy orange and I did actually eat it shortly after I took this photo. You can see it really picks up the light quite well. It was a very sunny day, so we had some nice light that could shine through the orange, which I think sort of like added a bit sort of like luminosity to it. So this is the image I chose, and I'll show you how I went about painting it. So with a lot of these paintings, I will often start by doing what's called the tonal ground. Sometimes when I'm particularly painting in oils, I might just do this in some burnt sienna, using some mineral spirits, and just do a layer underneath. But because I was sort of prepping this in advance, I decided I was going to do an acrylic base. So I used some fluorescent orange paint with a little bit of burnt umber just to bring down the sort of brightness a little. And I got this sort of odd sort of flesh tone, which was quite interesting. The reason you use a tonal ground is so that you've got like a mid-base layer of colour. So you're not just starting on a pure white canvas. Which can be a bit intimidating, but also it's kind of hard to tell your light areas from your dark areas. So starting with the sort of mid-level range is really helpful and can really sort of set you up to sort of success really when painting. I basically mixed the paint as well with a little bit of white gesso. This is why it's got a slight sort of a lighter tone to it. But I think it worked quite well. After it dried, I then started drawing. So you can see here as well, I've got the iPad set up right next to my canvas. This is really super helpful because you've got something like right at eye level, so you can see what you're painting as you're doing it. And then I just used a 4B, I believe it was, pencil and just drew directly onto the canvas from here. I will normally try and do a sketch before working directly on the canvas, but in this situation I decided to just make a start directly on the canvas, and I think it worked quite well. Obviously I draw a lot as well, and it's a good skill to have as well. Sometimes I will start drawing directly in paint. So if I'm doing that technique, I will often just use a brush with maybe some burnt sienna or maybe another colour, and then I will paint directly on the canvas. A technique I have kind of developed recently that has been quite successful for me has been drawing in pencil first, and then I use Liquitex paint markers, which are acrylic. I happen to use an orange colour for this one, which is super handy. And then just go directly over all of the outlines until I've got it there. The benefit of doing this is when you're doing it with pencil, you can often paint over the top and it becomes a bit muddy. So the graphite kind of moves around a bit as it gets sort of like mixed in with the paint, and you can sometimes lose your drawing a little bit if you don't do an isolation layer beforehand. But because I'd already toned the canvas with acrylic, I used the acrylic paint pens on this just to get that level and get that layer drawn up on there, and it means it's not going to be moved around at all by the oils. Now speaking of the oils, I popped all these out onto my palette. I've got like quite a nice palette here, it's quite big. I know sometimes I will use a tear off sheet, sometimes I don't. In this situation I just had clean palettes, so put the paints directly on there. I always start with a nice titanium white, cadmium yellow, cadmium orange as well for this one. Also a little bit of burnt umber, which helps sort of bring the sort of like tones down a little bit. And then there's also a little bit of phthalo blue on there as well. Sometimes I use ultramarine blue, sometimes I use phthalo blue. It depends on what sort of vibe I'm kind of going for with the painting. And sometimes I'll even use a Prussian blue, which is a lot darker, so you can get a lot deeper colours to start off with. Now, as you can see here, I always try and do like an underpainting whenever I work on something like this, just to get the darkest darks and the lightest lights, and it just helps sort of like build up the sort of picture to start off with. I also tried with this to add a bit of the green and the blue tone to the background. This was really helpful in just getting a vibe for what the colours would look like in the final painting. It's kind of nice to have something to work from and know once you've got your sort of main colours down that you can kind of work up to it. Sometimes when I'm doing these, I will do a sort of a monochrome underpainting where I'll only use one colour of paint and do all of the painting with the light areas just being areas where I've either scrubbed off some of the paint or I've just done it slightly lighter. But in this situation I just went straight on with some colour. And then as you can see here, I started building up some of the layers for the wooden board that the orange slices were on. I used a bit of the cadmium yellow and the cadmium orange mixed in with it here. It is looking a little muddy at this stage, and you will find with a lot of oil paintings you do get this sort of ugly stage where you've just put lots of paint on and it just, well, it looks ugly. But eventually it does start to sort of slowly form into the sort of shapes you want. I started adding some of the cadmium yellow. I was pretty excited to start adding that, just because you've got this sort of like luminosity with it. And I was quite excited to try and capture that, so I kind of just dove straight in with the cad yellow and the cadmium orange as well, just to kind of start building up those sort of colours. It was a really fun painting to do here. And I mostly just use the raw paints and a little bit of mineral spirits. You can see here it's starting to come together really quickly. I do actually work very quickly with this sort of stage of the painting, and it's amazing how fast everything starts to build up once you've got a few colours down, and it starts to slowly form into what you imagine it being in the final version. And I think it's just nice to get those sort of like those tonal values and those key colour areas sort of established here. Now, obviously the shadows on this are a lot darker than they are in the final painting. Part of that is just because of the underpainting bit. I wanted to get enough shadow down so then I could lighten it up and add a bit of luminosity. But it's just generally sort of, it's a process where I'll maybe do one layer and find out, no, that's too dark, and then I'll put something else on top. For the rind itself, I found it quite tricky actually. You think in your head that it's supposed to be white because that's what you're used to seeing with an orange. So kind of getting these sort of like darker tones to sort of like accentuate the light shining through the orange is quite difficult. That's why sort of I wanted to make sure that I could get them quite dark on this, because they are in shadow, and if they are too light then the luminosity of those orange wedges doesn't really shine through. So that's where I'm going here with having a bit of blue in there and trying to make it a sort of grey and sort of rich. This is a little bit of a zoom in. You can see how it's building up on the canvas. Quite rough marks at the moment, but everything's kind of represented where it's supposed to be. You can see it's still quite wet as well, but there's not actually that much paint. The layers are quite thin at this point. The paint's very watered down with the mineral spirits, and I slowly start to build it up over the top. So you can see at this stage, I'm basically just starting to fill in a lot more of the highlights. It kind of starts to build up really quickly, because I've got that base layer of the paint already there. The painting can slowly develop. I'm also sort of like starting to lighten some of the areas and just start to add some more of those colours in. This sort of stage of the painting does tend to get a bit longer. You kind of just have to persevere with it. The early stages happen really quickly, so you're putting lots of paint down, lots of things are happening, big decisions are being made, and then you kind of just start to get into the refining stage where you're slowly just starting to build it up and push things around. There's a lot of paint on there, you can see. A lot of it's kind of quite desaturated and quite dark. So now it's kind of about bringing in some more saturation and some more colour and kind of just making it feel more. You can see as well, as we're slowly building up more and more layers of this, that we're getting a lot more detail starting to come into place now. So we're getting some highlights, particularly highlights on the main sort of orange wedge there in the front, and then also the sort of one sort of right in the middle of this sort of composition itself. So we're getting some highlights on the edges, we're starting to get a bit more shadows, and then we're also starting to get these sort of reflection and diffused light areas as well. So this is areas where the light might be refracting around, and because obviously the orange does cast a shadow, but it's also reflecting on that surface, so we want to see that that surface has taken some of the reflection of that orange there. So we start to build up these orange specular and diffused light around it in the shadow areas as well, and you can see that here where we're actually bringing in a lot more richness into this sort of wooden panel that's there, just to sort of make that more real, really, and have that light reflect through. I think it's important to remember when painting anything like this that these objects do have a slight translucency, but also light doesn't always just go in one straight line. It does bounce around, and you can see that in the photographs as well. And it's important not to have black or dark shadows because they don't really look like that in real life. You can have really dark areas, and you can also have some like really desaturated shadows, but often there are a lot of other light sources and colours there reflecting around, so it's nice to reflect that in your shadows and in your areas when you're painting them. So you can see from the slight angle change that I kind of came back to this to work on it from a different point of view. So I've been doing a lot on the oranges, but because I've taken the photo with depth of field, and I wanted to have like a blurred background, in my initial stages you can not really tell what's going on there, but I wanted to start getting in some more of those deep greens and some of those blues, which if you have a look on the colour wheel, they kind of really offset nicely with the sort of oranges and yellows. And so it was just about starting to put something in to sort of give this these oranges a bit of grounding, because before this point they were basically just sort of hovering in space. So now I'm just trying to sort of like fill this in. You might not really be able to tell what that is, but essentially it's a view of our windowsill. Our living room is actually a dark blue, so that's where you've got this sort of darkness and dark rich colour coming in, and the green bits in the foreground are actually we have these really nice fern plants which are really good and they kind of spread out, but when they're slightly out of focus it kind of just looks like this strange sort of amorphous green mass, which works really well. And you can actually also see in there's a bit of a trunk sort of coming up. That's actually our Chinese money tree that we call Bob, that lives in our living room. Sometimes when I do these sort of paintings, sometimes I will just do a plain coloured background, and that can work really well with some subjects. Sometimes it looks as though whatever it is that you're painting is just hovering in space. So it's kind of sometimes nice to ground these things in a bit more of reality, and particularly because the photo itself had this brilliant sort of depth of field. I zoomed really far in with my camera, and the background had gone really nice and blurred. I wanted to sort of have this nice view of the different layers to kind of add a bit of 3 dimensions to the painting. And you can see here as well, I've started adding some highlights to the orange peel. That's something I really wanted to try and get. There's a certain texture with orange peel, and it's kind of quite hard to get your head around it because it's not just like little dots of highlights. They've kind of got this sort of bumpiness with sort of little gaps in between it. And it did take me a few passes and a few attempts to try and get that just right. The other side of this as well is that the chopping board that the oranges are on got quite wet, mostly from the juice from the oranges. So as this sort of juice had started to pool, you had like little glossiness and little highlights showing where the juice had sort of gathered around the orange slices. So I wanted to try and get these sort of like little elements in place there as well. This one of these orange slices as well on its side, I still don't think I'm quite happy with it. I did rework it several times when I was going at it, and I think I eventually just sort of gave up and left it where it was. You'll kind of see that at the end as I'll talk you through it. But a lot of this phase was really just sort of trying to bump up the luminosity, try and get all of those sort of like little bits of colour and all of those different highlights, try and get the orange peel working quite well and trying to make it a bit more realistic. Now, as I said, I've not actually done one of these still lifes before, and I've never painted an orange before, so this was a bit of an experiment, a bit of a learning curve. I think I learned a lot from doing it, particularly with the orange peel. It looks like a simple thing to paint when you initially look at it and you think it's just going to be highlights, but it's really not. And I think that's something where, although I think I'm quite happy with how it's come out, I think there is still room for improvement there. And I don't always try and go for sort of photorealistic when I paint. It's something where I'll sometimes try and be a bit more impressionistic, or I'll try and sort of hint at things. Sometimes I'll get too focused in the detail and I have to stop myself. And it's something where when you're doing a still life, because you've got kind of quite a limited range of things that are in the frame, you're focusing on one particular object or a few things that are in the frame or in the composition itself. And you can kind of get lost in those elements and you can kind of overwork them. So part of this is also knowing when to stop with a particular element. You can see we've changed shots now, so you can see it a little bit closer in from this angle. Now, part of this was the highlights themselves started looking a little bit too white. I try not to do things too white when I do a painting, because if you've made something white, that's pretty much as far as you can go. So it's really hard to add additional highlights to that white area. So part of this was adding a little bit of yellow just to sort of add a bit of warmth, but also add a little bit of a different sort of feel to those highlights. And they were really actually very yellow as the light was shining through them. It was, like I said, it was a very sunny day. We had this gorgeous sort of golden light shining through that always comes through in our living room on really nice days. And that's something that it played really nicely with the luminosity and that translucency of the orange itself. And you can see as well with this bit of the pith at the top, you have these elements where some parts of them are translucent and it kind of shines through like stained glass, and some bits kind of they're opaque, but they pick up lots of bits of the light. So this sort of like furry, sort of indistinct fibryness that you get on the pith itself, on the segments. This particular orange bit here that you've seen me just work on, that's one of the bits that I've been struggling with. I did rework it around a few times. You can see it's a lot brighter in this bit, and I do make it a bit darker again, and I kind of push it around a little bit. But we're really starting to get a feel now for the actual the shapes of the oranges. You can see now I'm just adding in some of the membranes from the actual segment itself. You could see these through the light shining through the orange, and they're quite sort of fascinating to see through, kind of almost like veins. You see now I'm just kind of trying to tidy up the wooden chopping board a little bit. It had become a bit of an amorphous mess. A lot of the grain itself of the wood was all going in the same direction, so it was kind of nice. I think it was made of bamboo actually, the chopping board itself. but it had all of these nice streaks all going in the same direction. So I was just trying to sort of make sure that all of those lines are kind of going in the right place. But ultimately that kind of makes it difficult, particularly when you're trying to pull in the shadows. And because it's oil, everything kind of builds up on top of each other, and if I was doing this in acrylics, it's kind of sometimes easier to do just like a glaze over the top because it's already dried, and it's just easier to do these sort of like translucent or transparent layers on there. It's kind of an interesting sort of backdrop, really. The ferns themselves are actually kind of quite nice to look at, but how they came out in the photograph, they were very, it just came out as a sort of blurry green mass. So I kind of reflected that, really. You can see here I'm just adding a few like little specular highlights just in some detail. I thought I'd give you a little bit of a zoom in just to see what they look like. And then this is what the palette looked like when it was done. And finally, this is the final painting. So what do you think? I'll zoom in a little bit here and you can have a look at this. After it dried, after a little bit, I decided to oil it out. If you don't know what that is, there's lots of YouTube videos that can explain how to oil out a canvas, particularly after you've let it dry for a little bit. This one hasn't been varnished yet, but it will be varnished sort of in a few months' time when it's dry. So this is my painting of some oranges, so tell me what you think. I'll probably try and do some more still lifes. And this is my painting process, and I hope it's been really useful for you to see how I actually paint these things. So goodbye for now.